In 2006, chipmaker AMD made a bold move that almost destroyed the company. It spent $5.4 billion to buy top graphics card maker ATI Technologies, a deal that saddled AMD with massive debt and pushed it to the brink of financial ruin. Yet in a twist of fate, that same move planted the seeds of AMD's eventual revival. This is the paradox of AMD's ATI acquisition. The deal that nearly broke the company, but also gave it the technological lifeline that would help save it in the long run. To understand why AMD gambled on ATI, we need the backdrop of the mid-2000s CPU wars. AMD, Advanced Micro Devices, was the perennial underdog to Intel in the PC processor market. But by 2005, AMD's engineering had leapfrogged Intel's in key areas. Its Athlon 64 chips introduced 64-bit computing to consumers and often outperformed Intel's offerings at similar price points. AMD even led the shift to dual-core CPUs, briefly stealing the performance crown from Intel. For the first time, Intel looked vulnerable in its own game. Intel, however, was not about to roll over. The giant still held far greater resources, fabs, and marketing muscle. It fought back fiercely, and not always fairly. Intel was later revealed to have paid PC makers not to use AMD chips, an anti-competitive tactic that cost Intel a $1.25 billion legal settlement to AMD in 2009. But by then, Intel's new Core 2 Duo processors, launched in mid-2006, had decisively regained the performance lead. AMD's brief edge evaporated as Intel's manufacturing and design might, the famous tick-tock cycle of rapid chip improvements, kicked into high gear. AMD knew it needed a new strategy to compete with a rival 5 times its size. Simply matching Intel chip for chip was a losing proposition. AMD's CEO at the time, Hector Ruiz, believed the answer was to differentiate, offer something Intel couldn't easily replicate. Intel made CPUs, chipsets, and even basic graphics chips for PCs, a full platform. AMD only made CPUs and relied on partners for the rest. What if AMD could also offer an all-in-one platform of its own, combining world-class CPUs and graphics? This strategic vision set the stage for the ATI acquisition. Meanwhile, in the graphics market, ATI Technologies, based in Canada, and California-based NVIDIA were locked in a fierce rivalry of their own. Graphics processing units, GPUs, had become essential for rendering video game visuals and accelerating multimedia. ATI's Radeon and NVIDIA's GeForce graphics cards traded performance blows with each new generation, and each company held roughly half of the discrete GPU market in the mid-2000s. In 2006, ATI had about 43% of the add-in graphics card market versus NVIDIA's 57%, so the two were close competitors. ATI was known for innovations like the first DirectX 9 GPUs, while NVIDIA had scored hits with its GeForce 6 and 7 series. Importantly, ATI was also supplying graphics chips for game consoles. It provided the GPU for Microsoft's Xbox 360 and Nintendo's Wii, both of which launched in 2005 to 2006. GPUs weren't just about gaming either. A TI had branched into mobile phone graphics and digital TV chips, and its Radeon graphics were finding uses in professional workstations. NVIDIA similarly was exploring GPU computing for science and AI even back then. In other words, graphics technology was becoming central to more computing tasks, not just playing games. AMD watched this trend and saw an opportunity. By acquiring ATI, AMD would instantly become a leading supplier of GPUs and chipsets, the support chips that connect a CPU to the rest of a system. It could pair its CPUs with ATI's GPUs to offer whole new types of processors. So in July 2006, AMD pulled the trigger. It announced a deal to buy ATI for $5.4 billion in cash and stock. It was a blockbuster merger in the chip industry. The goal? Create a one-stop-shop chip company that could compete with Intel on equal footing by selling combined CPU-GPU solutions. It would certainly put AMD on a more equal footing relative to Intel, said one analyst at the time. AMD's plan was to develop fusion processors, later called APUs, accelerated processing units, that would integrate central processing and graphics processing on a single chip. This was a forward-looking idea that, if successful, could revolutionize PCs and laptops. After all, why have a separate graphics chip if your main processor could handle graphics too? AMD foresaw a future where CPUs and GPUs converged. On paper, the AMD ATI combination made a lot of strategic sense. By uniting ATI's graphics expertise with AMD's CPU know-how, the company could build hybrid chips years ahead of the competition. These Fusion APUs promised better performance per watt and cost for everyday computing, since a single chip could do the work of two. AMD's technical teams were excited about the possibilities: shared memory between CPU and GPU, faster data transfers, and new ways to accelerate software. This concept of heterogeneous computing, using CPU and GPU together efficiently, was an area AMD could lead. There were immediate benefits too. ATI brought AMD a portfolio of products and markets it didn't have before. Suddenly, AMD was not just a CPU maker, but also a leading graphics chip vendor in PCs and laptops. AMD gained ATI's strong relationships with major PC manufacturers for GPUs and chipsets. It also inherited contracts for the Xbox 360's graphics and Nintendo's Wii graphics, meaning AMD Silicon would be in millions of game consoles. Down the line, that console heritage would only grow. More on that later. ATI's presence in mobile phone graphics, the Imagen line, gave AMD a foothold, however small, in the emerging smartphone era as well. In theory, AMD could now compete with both Intel and Nvidia at the same time, something neither of those two could do across CPUs and high-end GPUs. AMD's executives pitched the merger as a way to match or even exceed Intel's capabilities. Intel itself had been building modest integrated graphics into its chipsets, but those were weak compared to ATI's Radeon GPUs. With ATI, AMD could offer PC makers a superior one-stop solution: a CPU with built-in Radeon graphics, plus the accompanying chipset, all from one vendor. This was especially aimed at notebooks, where power and space savings from integration are valuable. AMD bet that winning just a few more points of market share from Intel, each percentage point worth approximately $300 million in revenue, would justify the $5.4 billion price tag. Platforms that integrate the functions of several different chips will be more attractive, asserted CEO Hector Ruiz as the deal was announced. On the graphics side, the acquisition also put Nvidia on notice. Nvidia relied on selling GPUs and chipsets for AMD's CPU platform as part of its business. Suddenly, AMD would have its own in-house graphics, potentially squeezing Nvidia out of future AMD-based PCs. And longer term, if AMD's vision of fused CPU-GPU chips came true, it might undercut the need for many low-end discrete graphics cards, a market Nvidia served. In reality, Nvidia responded by deepening its focus on the high-end and new markets like GPU computing. But in 2006, it was certainly a worrying development for them. AMD was doubling down on the idea of CPU-GPU synergy, and it spooked Nvidia enough that rumors swirled about a possible Intel-Nvidia alliance, or even Intel acquiring Nvidia, which never came to pass. From a technological perspective, AMD's move was prescient. Today, virtually all consumer CPUs, Intel, AMD, and even Apple Silicon, have integrated graphics. That concept was pioneered by AMD's Fusion initiative. The problem was never the vision, it was the timing and execution, and the steep price paid. To pull off this plan, AMD would have to survive a coming storm that no one fully saw on the horizon. AMD closed the ATI acquisition in October 2006, just as the PC industry was about to hit a rough patch. The timing turned out to be brutal. AMD had taken on a $2.5 billion loan to finance the mostly cash deal, leaving it with a heavy debt load. Then everything that could go wrong did. In late 2006 and 2007, Intel slashed CPU prices and released a wave of faster Core 2 quad processors, igniting a price war that hurt AMD's margins. At the same time, the first fruits of the AMD-ATI marriage were slow to materialize. designing integrated CPU-GPU chips is complex and takes years. AMD was now fighting on two fronts, against Intel in CPUs and Nvidia in GPUs, and bleeding cash. Then came late 2007 into 2008, the global financial crisis. The PC market, which had been growing robustly, slowed dramatically as consumer and business spending tightened. Demand for chips faltered just as AMD most needed sales to pay down its new debt. AMD's revenues plunged, and it started posting steep losses quarter after quarter. By the end of 2007, AMD was forced to write down the value of ATI on its books, effectively admitting it overpaid. Now we know for a fact that AMD overpaid for ATI, said one analyst in December 2007, as AMD prepared to take a substantial goodwill impairment charge. In other words, the acquired business wasn't worth what AMD paid, at least in the short term. The Great Recession of 2008 only made things worse. Credit became tight, and AMD's large debt became an albatross. The company had to spend precious cash on interest payments at a time when it desperately needed to fund new product development. AMD's R&D spending flatlined just when Intel was ramping up investment. One industry analyst noted AMD's disadvantage starkly. Nvidia could spend $500 million a year on graphics R&D, while AMD, strained by debt, could only afford around $200 million. With Intel out-investing AMD on CPUs and Nvidia out-investing on GPUs, AMD was in a dangerous squeeze. Inside AMD, the acquisition integration proved challenging as well. Combining two large engineering teams and cultures is never easy. There were overlaps in chipsets and marketing teams to sort out, and some key ATI talent left after the merger. AMD also continued to suffer delays on its next-gen CPU microarchitecture, codenamed Barcelona for servers and Phenom for desktops. When those finally launched in late 2007, they were plagued by a performance bug and couldn't fully regain ground from Intel. In short, by 2008, AMD was overextended, underperforming, and running out of time. The company's stock price cratered to historic lows. In late 2008, AMD shares dipped under $2, a stunning fall from around $20 at the time of the ATI deal. Rumors of bankruptcy began to circulate. AMD had to take drastic action to survive the storm. To stay afloat, AMD undertook a painful restructuring. In 2008 to 2009, it laid off thousands of employees and slashed costs to the bone. Most dramatically, in 2009, AMD spun off its crown jewel manufacturing arm into a new company called Global Foundries. This move, backed by investments from an Abu Dhabi state fund, allowed AMD to shed the burden of its chip factories and the huge capital expenses they required. It brought in some cash and meant AMD no longer had to foot the bill for upgrading fabs, but at the cost of losing direct control over production. The spin-off was essentially forced by AMD's financial woes. The company simply couldn't afford to both design and manufacture chips anymore. AMD also started selling off pieces of ATI that didn't fit its new leaner strategy. The handheld graphics division, Imagen, that ATI had, which made smartphone GPUs, was sold to Qualcomm in 2008. Qualcomm's Adreno mobile graphics today are a direct descendant of ATI's tech. AMD sold a digital TV chip business, another part of ATI, to Broadcom. These sales raised some badly needed cash and allowed AMD to focus on its core PC and console graphics. But it showed that AMD couldn't fully capitalize on all of ATI's assets. It had to cut its losses to survive. Despite these measures, AMD entered the 2010s still carrying a lot of debt and a tarnished reputation. The period from about 2006 to 2016 is often referred to as AMD's lost decade. The ATI acquisition, though strategically sound, had crippled AMD's finances and hamstrung its ability to compete. Consider AMD's market share in its two main businesses. In CPUs, AMD's share of the x86 processor market plummeted from roughly 48% in early 2006, nearly parity with Intel thanks to the Athlon 64 era, to just about 20% by the end of 2015. Intel raced ahead to nearly 80% share as AMD fell behind technologically and couldn't keep up in performance. AMD's CPU lineup, Athlon Phenom and later the Bulldozer-based FX series, lagged Intel's Core series badly in single-core speed and power efficiency. Each AMD attempt to catch up, Phenom in 2007, Bulldozer in 2011, fell short, and Intel continued to dominate the high end. AMD was left largely competing on price and core count, offering more cores for less money, but this wasn't enough to stop the bleeding in market share. In GPUs, ATI's old rival Nvidia pulled far ahead. Around the merger in 2006, the two were evenly matched. But by 2015, Nvidia had come to utterly dominate discrete graphics with about 80% of the add-in GPU market versus 20% for AMD. Nvidia's GeForce GTX series consistently outperformed AMD's Radeon cards in the profitable high-end segment, and Nvidia invested heavily in software, like CUDA for GPU computing and proprietary features for gamers, that gave it an edge. AMD's Radeon division had some bright spots. Certain Radeon HD cards in 2008 to 2011 were very competitive, even leapfrogging Nvidia briefly. But AMD couldn't sustain momentum. R&D constraints and some architectural missteps, e.g. the hot and power-hungry Fermi generation, affected Nvidia for a short time. But AMD's bulldozer moment on the CPU side was a longer setback, meant AMD was often a generation behind. The debt from the ATI deal acted like a ball and chain on AMD throughout this period. Every dollar of interest paid was a dollar not going into engineering new chips. AMD's total debt stayed in the billions, about $2 billion as of 2016, forcing the company to be very conservative with spending. By contrast, Intel was pouring money into R&D, and Nvidia, a smaller company than AMD at the time, focused all its resources on graphics and surged ahead. AMD simply could not afford any big mistakes in execution, but unfortunately, several happened. The Llano APU in 2011, one of the first true AMD Fusion chips, was delayed by manufacturing issues and launched to lukewarm results. The subsequent Bulldozer CPU architecture, 2011, was meant to be a revolutionary design combining some CPU resources for efficiency, but it ended up underperforming per core and consumed too much power. This left AMD with chips that were okay for multi-threaded tasks, but weak in the everyday workloads where Intel excelled. Laptop makers mostly shunned AMD's CPUs for premium models, further hurting AMD's market presence. As the 2010s progressed, AMD cycled through multiple CEOs and reorganizations. Longtime CEO Hector Ruiz stepped down in 2008 amid the company's struggles, and was later embroiled in an insider trading scandal. His successor, Dirk Meyer, who had overseen some stability and the successful 2009 launch of the first Fusion APUs, was ousted in 2011, partly for not having a convincing mobile strategy. The leadership turmoil continued with interim CEOs until Rory Reid took the helm in 2011 and then Lisa Su in 2014. This high executive turnover reflected AMD's internal confusion and the pressure of constant losses. It's hard to execute a long-term vision when you're fighting for your life each quarter. By the mid-2010s, AMD was strapped for cash, losing talent, and watching its market share erode to multi-decade lows. Tech analysts openly speculated that AMD might not survive much longer. One investment firm boldly predicted in 2015 that AMD would go bankrupt by 2020 if it stayed on the same trajectory. AMD's stock was languishing around $2 to $3, and the company's market cap was a tiny fraction of what it had been. It truly was the darkest time in AMD's history, a lost decade where the ambitious bet on ATI seemed to have done more harm than good. So why did the deal almost destroy AMD? The simple answer: money. AMD overpaid at the peak of the market, walked into a recession, and drowned in debt and interest. All the strategic benefits in the world couldn't overcome the cold hard math of a $5+ billion expenditure for a company that only had about $5.8 billion in annual revenue at the time. The timing meant AMD couldn't capitalize on ATI's tech quickly enough to justify the cost. It's a classic case of a strategically sound idea executed at the worst possible moment. AMD was left painfully deleveraging and retrenching for 10 years just to stay alive. Despite the odds, AMD did not go bankrupt. How did this battered company manage to survive the lost decade? The story of AMD's survival is one of relentless cost-cutting, a few clutch wins, and the gradual sowing of seeds that would later bloom. One key lifeline was game consoles. Remember those ATI-designed chips in the Xbox 360 and Wii? That business only grew. In 2011 to 2013, AMD scored a huge win by securing the graphics and CPU chip designs for all three major game consoles of the next generation. Sony's PlayStation 4 and Microsoft's Xbox One, both launched in late 2013, were built on semi-custom AMD APU chips, essentially an AMD CPU and AMD Radeon GPU combined, tailored for each console. Even Nintendo's Wii U around 2012 used an AMD ATI graphics chip. These deals were transformative. They provided a steady revenue stream via semi-custom chip sales and put AMD technology into tens of millions of living rooms. In fact, by 2013, AMD finally returned to profitability, largely thanks to the Xbox One and PS4 ramping up production. It was a modest profit, but it broke a long streak of losses and proved that the company still had valuable IP. The console win also validated the original idea behind the ATI acquisition. An AMD APU could be the heart of powerful devices beyond the PC. Another saving grace was a bit of legal vindication, the $1.25 billion antitrust settlement from Intel in 2009. That infusion of cash couldn't fix AMD's business issues, but it certainly helped pay down some debt and fund operations during critical years. It was essentially a penalty Intel paid for the shady tactics that hurt AMD in the mid-2000s. AMD used every advantage it could get. AMD also refocused on what it could do well with limited resources. It pivoted to an approach called semi-custom chip design, where it would use its core CPU/GPU IP to make tailored chips for specific big customers. The console chips were one example. AMD also landed deals to put x86 chips in some enterprise hardware, and later a Chinese game console project. These weren't huge profit centers, but they kept the lights on. AMD's graphics division, Radeon, though second to Nvidia, continued to innovate enough to keep a loyal following among PC gamers on a budget. The Radeon HD 4000 series, 2008, and HD 5000 series, 2009, were quite competitive, briefly giving AMD a leap ahead. The HD 5870 was the first DirectX 11 GPU and beat Nvidia to the punch. Even later, cards like the R9290X 2013 delivered high performance for the price. This kept AMD in the game and ensured Nvidia never had a complete monopoly on graphics. Behind the scenes, AMD's engineers were quietly working on a grand comeback plan. In 2012, AMD brought back Jim Keller, a famed chip architect who had helped design past successes, like the early Athlon 64 and later went to Apple. Keller and the team set about creating a brand new CPU architecture from scratch, one that could finally put AMD back in the race with Intel. This project, which became known as Zen, would take about 4 years to come to fruition, and it required AMD to make a big all-or-nothing bet on high-performance x86 CPUs again. Given the financial stress, it was a bold effort, but AMD didn't have much choice: either differentiate strongly or fade away. Throughout this survival period, something interesting was happening. AMD was becoming very scrappy and efficient out of necessity. The company learned to do more with less. For example, the decision to use one core technology across multiple products, PC, server, console, meant AMD could spread R&D costs around. The ATI acquisition had given AMD lots of valuable IP blocks, memory controllers, interface technologies, graphics cores, that could be mixed and matched. Even when AMD's discrete GPUs fell behind Nvidia at the top end, the same GPU architectures found success in integrated forms, like laptop APUs and consoles. By 2016, AMD was scarred, but alive. It had roughly 10,000 employees, down from 15,000 plus at the peak, and was a much smaller company relative to its competitors. But it had survived the gauntlet that many thought would kill it. The stage was set for one of tech's great comeback stories. The very next year, 2017, AMD launched the Zen-based Ryzen CPUs, shocking Intel and beginning AMD's renaissance. And here's the key. None of that comeback would have been possible if AMD hadn't kept ATI's GPU technology in-house. In fact, that technology was about to prove more important than ever. It's now clear with hindsight that the ATI acquisition, for all its short-term pain, gave AMD exactly the assets it needed to rise again in the late 2010s. When AMD introduced its Ryzen CPUs, built on the Zen architecture, in 2017, the chips were hugely competitive with Intel on performance and price, instantly restoring AMD's relevance in the CPU arena. But crucially, AMD's strategy from that point was not just about standalone CPUs. The company doubled down on the formula of combining CPUs and GPUs, fulfilling the original Fusion vision over a decade later, but this time with far better execution. One immediate advantage was in the data center and supercomputing field. AMD could now offer servers and HPC systems, something Intel couldn't. High-performance GPUs alongside high-performance CPUs from one vendor. In 2020, AMD won the contract for the US Frontier exascale supercomputer, supplying both its EPYC CPUs and Radeon Instinct GPUs as a total solution. A feat only possible because AMD had both CPU and GPU expertise under one roof. It's exactly the kind of CPU-GPU synergy the ATI deal had envisioned. Meanwhile, Intel has struggled to develop competitive discrete GPUs. Its attempts over the years never really threatened NVIDIA or AMD until very recently. AMD's head start with ATI's tech gave it a permanent foothold in graphics that Intel lacked. In the consumer space, APUs became mainstream. AMD's Ryzen processors came in versions with integrated Radeon graphics that far outclassed Intel's integrated graphics at the time. For budget gamers or mainstream users, an AMD APU meant you didn't need a separate graphics card for decent performance, precisely the selling point AMD had imagined in 2006. This became a strong niche for AMD, especially in laptop markets and entry-level desktops. By 2020, even Intel had to respond by hiring away AMD's graphics veterans, including the former Radeon chief architect, and investing billions to catch up in GPU capability. It's telling that Intel's big new graphics initiative, the Intel Arc GPUs launched in 2022, essentially happened because Intel saw how CPU alone was not enough, a truth AMD bet on way back in 2006. Another pillar of AMD's resurgence was the continued success of semi-custom chips and consoles. In 2020, Sony and Microsoft once again chose AMD to power the PlayStation 5 and Xbox Series X. These consoles use highly advanced AMD APUs, 8-core Zen CPUs with RDNA2 Radeon graphics. The ATI lineage is evident. The graphics architecture in those consoles is a direct descendant of Radeon technologies. Those console wins provided huge revenues and also pushed AMD's graphics tech to improve. The RDNA architecture was developed in tandem with console needs in mind, leading to big gains in efficiency that also benefited PC GPUs. So when you see a PlayStation 5 today, you're looking at the product of the AMD ATI marriage, something neither original company could have made alone. Even in the discrete graphics card market, AMD's fortunes improved enough that it could compete more closely with NVIDIA again by the late 2000s. The Radeon RX 5000 and 6000 series, 2019 to 2020, based on the new RDNA architecture, narrowed the gap with NVIDIA's GeForce in performance, and in some cases offered better value. While NVIDIA still holds the performance crown and majority market share, AMD's Radeon Group remains a crucial competitive force that keeps innovation rolling and prices in check. For the tech enthusiasts, think of features like high-bandwidth memory or chiplet-based GPU designs. AMD has been a pioneer in some areas, forcing NVIDIA to respond. In short, AMD, having ATI's DNA, allowed it to stay a full-spectrum player in computing. One could argue that AMD's very identity transformed because of the ATI deal. It went from that other CPU company to a broader semiconductor firm whose expertise spans computing, graphics, and now even machine learning accelerators. Today, as of mid-2020s, AMD's product lineup includes CPUs that challenge Intel's best, GPUs that challenge NVIDIA's best, and combinations of the two that carve out unique advantages, exactly what the company envisioned nearly 2 decades ago. AMD's market capitalization and stock price have soared in recent years, reflecting its dramatic turnaround from the brink. It's a testament to how the long-term strategic value of ATI finally materialized.